Daniel was an ordinary man who lived in a small quiet town where the nights were silent and the stars shone like old forgotten fires in the sky, and he never expected that his life would change in a way that felt impossible yet terrifying and strange. And on one of those nights when the town was deep asleep and the world outside his window was wrapped in silence, he noticed something unusual, something that made his heart beat a little faster and made his breath catch in his throat, because high above the dark sky there were lights moving in patterns that no airplane, no satellite, and no shooting star could ever make, and the colors were not the kind he had seen before. They shimmered with silver and blue, and they pulsed like a living heart across the black canvas of the night. Daniel stood at his window, unable to move as the lights danced and twisted, and then suddenly streaked downward as if something was falling, and his whole body shook with a strange sense of dread mixed with awe, and he thought maybe it was just his tired eyes playing tricks, or maybe a storm, or maybe something natural. But in the depth of his chest, a voice told him that this was not natural at all. This was something different and dangerous, and he tried to convince himself to go back to sleep and forget what he had seen, yet his mind could not let it go. The next morning everything seemed ordinary again. The birds sang their usual songs, the neighbors went to work, and the sun lit the small town in the same way it always did. But Daniel could not stop thinking about the lights in the sky, and as the day passed, he tried to ignore the uneasy feeling that grew heavier in his stomach, until at last when evening came he went to his basement. Because he had heard a sound there earlier, a faint metallic thud, as if something had moved in the dark corner where nothing should be, and he thought it must be a rat or some old tool falling. Yet when he stepped down the wooden stairs he felt the air grow colder, and his skin shivered as if something unseen was breathing close to him. The basement was dim and filled with shadows, and Daniel carried only a weak flashlight in his trembling hand, and as the circle of light moved across the concrete floor, he saw something that made him freeze in place and made his voice die in his throat, because lying there against the wall was not a rat and not a tool, but a figure that looked human and yet not human at all. Her skin glowed faintly with a silver light like moonlight trapped inside her veins, and her eyes opened slowly to reveal a molten shine that no human eyes could ever hold. Daniel stepped back, almost dropping the flashlight, and he wanted to run, but he could not, because the figure spoke with a voice that was soft and weak, yet filled with certainty, and she whispered, "My husband," and the words hit Daniel like a wave of ice because they made no sense. And yet she looked at him as if she truly believed it, and his mind raced with fear and confusion as he stammered that she must be mistaken, and that he had never seen her before in his life. But she only reached a trembling hand toward him and repeated the words with desperate insistence, "My husband." Daniel shook his head and tried to make sense of it, but the sight before him only grew stranger, because beside her lay broken fragments of some kind of device, shining with wires and crystal shards that gave off faint sparks as if it had once carried power from a world far beyond his understanding. And the smell in the basement was sharp and metallic like burnt air after lightning, and he realized this must be connected to the lights he had seen in the sky last night, and the idea filled him with dread, because it meant that whatever had fallen was now here in his basement, breathing and speaking to him. Knelt slowly, because despite his fear he saw that she was hurt. Her skin bore wounds that glowed faintly like cracked glass, and her body trembled with weakness, and she whispered that she could not survive here without him, and that he was the only one who could help her. And Porce, Daniel felt torn, because every instinct told him to call the police or the army or anyone who could deal with something not of this world. But another part of him, the part that saw the pain in her shining eyes, could not turn away. As the night deepened and the shadows in the basement grew longer, Daniel remained there staring at the alien woman who claimed to be his wife from some unknown world, and though he did not understand who she was, or why she had come, or how she could possibly know his name and face, he understood one thing with painful clarity: his life had just changed forever, and Whatever path he took now, there would be no turning back. Daniel did not sleep that night because his mind could not rest and his body stayed tense as he sat in the basement, staring at the strange woman who lay weak and trembling on the floor, and he kept asking himself if this was some dream or if he had lost his mind. But every time she opened her glowing eyes and whispered his name, he knew this was real and it was happening to him, and there was no escape from it. And when the first light of morning touched the windows upstairs, he realized that he had spent hours watching her without moving because he was afraid that if he left her side she might vanish or something worse might happen. He brought her water, though he was not sure if she could drink it, but she touched the glass with shaking fingers and managed to take a sip, and when she did, she looked at him with such deep relief that his heart twisted inside his chest, and he felt an emotion he could not explain. And then she spoke again, her voice soft and low as if it was carried from a faraway place, and she said her name was Lyra, and she said she had come a long way searching for him because he was her bond, her partner, her only link to life in this strange world. Daniel could not understand it, and he asked her again and again what she meant, but her words were always the same. She said her people had a way to feel the soul of their true partner even across the stars, and she had felt him for years like a light calling to her, and when war destroyed her home, she followed that light and it brought her here to Earth and to him, and now she could not survive without him because his presence, his touch, his voice gave her strength. Daniel wanted to deny it. He wanted to believe this was madness because he was just an ordinary man who worked at a local store and lived in a small house and had never been special. But as he looked at her pale glowing skin and the strange wounds across her body, he knew she was not lying, and something in his chest whispered that maybe she was right. Maybe there was more to his life than he had ever believed. Problem was that he could not let anyone know about her because already he had seen strange drones in the sky, small metallic shapes moving too slowly to be birds and too silent to be airplanes, and they had strange lights on their sides, and he had heard on the local radio that the government was looking for signs of a falling object, and he knew if they found her, they would take her away, and she would be lost forever, and maybe worse. And the thought filled him with fear and anger, so Daniel hid her in the basement and brought blankets and food and water, and though she ate little, she seemed to grow stronger whenever he stayed close to her, and one evening as the sun went down, she reached out and touched his hand with her glowing fingers, and a strange warmth spread through him like fire in his veins, and she whispered that this was the bond that kept her alive, and Daniel felt his knees weaken, because it was as if she was telling the truth, not with words, but with something deeper that touched his very soul. Days passed like this, with Daniel living two lives, one where he went outside and pretended everything was normal, and one where he returned home, entered the basement, and found Lyra waiting for him with eyes that looked at him like he was the center of her world. And though he told himself it was impossible, he began to feel the same, because every word she spoke, every look she gave, made him want to protect her more and more, even if he did not fully understand why. But danger was growing closer each day, because people in the town whispered of strange lights in the sky, and officials were knocking on doors, asking questions. And when Daniel saw them in the street speaking to his neighbors, his heart nearly stopped, because he knew sooner or later they would come to him, and they would search, and they would find her, and then everything would be lost. One night, when the air outside was heavy with the sound of distant helicopters, Daniel went into the basement and told Lyra that they could not stay here forever, and she nodded as if she had known this already, and she showed him something he had not seen before. Hidden beneath her torn clothes, she carried a small crystal shard that glowed faintly with inner light, and she held it close and whispered that it carried memories from her world. And when she pressed it to his forehead, Daniel gasped, because images filled his mind of places he had never seen: towers of glass rising in the skies of two suns, oceans that shone with colors no human eye had ever known, and a great hall where Lyra stood dressed in silver beside a figure that looked like him, only it was not him, and yet it was Daniel. Pulled back shaking, because he did not understand, and he asked how this was possible, and Lyra told him that their bond was written before he was even born, and that across the stars their souls had been connected, and that one day she would find him, and now she had, and even though he did not believe in destiny, he could not deny the power of the vision that still burned in his mind. He wanted to argue, he wanted to run, but when he looked at her fragile face and her trembling hands, he could not, and something deep inside him told him that maybe, just maybe, all his life he had been waiting for this moment, without knowing it, and that was when he heard the sound outside the house, the crunch of heavy boots on the gravel, and the low voices of soldiers moving in the dark, and his blood ran cold, because they were searching his street, and they were coming closer step by step. Lyra looked at him with fear in her glowing eyes, and she whispered that they must not find her, or both of them would be lost, and Daniel stood frozen, torn between fear and resolve, knowing that the next few moments would decide everything, and the bond between them that had only just begun would either be broken forever or grow unbreakable in the face of the danger that was now standing at his very door. The night outside was heavy and tense, and Daniel felt every sound like a knife cutting into his nerves, because he could hear the crunch of boots on the gravel and the quiet murmur of soldiers moving from one house to another, and he knew it was only a matter of time before they came to his door, and he felt a cold sweat cover his body as he looked at Lyra, who was still weak, but her silver eyes were filled with fear, and also with trust, as if she believed that he could protect her even though he did not know how. Daniel moved quickly. He turned off every light in the house, and he whispered to Lyra that she had to stay silent and still, and he helped her up the basement stairs, though her steps were shaky, and every time she leaned on him he felt the strange warmth of her bond inside his chest, and it gave him strength to keep going, even as fear told him to run away and save only himself. But he could not leave her, now not after everything he had seen and felt. He led her to the back of the house where the shadows were thickest, and he prayed that the soldiers would not notice and just pass by. But his hope shattered when a sharp knock thundered at the front door, and a voice called out demanding that he open up for inspection, and Daniel froze, because he knew if they searched, they would find Lyra, and then it would all be over, and she would be taken from him. Without thinking, he pulled her out the back door into the night, and they moved across the small yard, their footsteps soft on the damp grass, and the cold air biting at their skin, and Daniel felt his heart hammering so hard he thought the soldiers would hear it, but he kept moving, pulling Lyra with him toward the trees at the edge of town, because he knew the woods might be the only place they could hide. And as they moved, he heard the front door crash open behind them, the sound of boots rushing inside his home, and angry voices shouting commands. They ran as fast as they could, though Lyra stumbled and her breath came in painful gasps, and Daniel had to half carry her through the dark, and every step felt like it could be their last, because the soldiers were close, and their flashlights cut through the night like sharp blades of light searching for prey, and Daniel could hear the sound of dogs barking somewhere far behind, and the roar of engines as vehicles moved down the streets, and he realized this was not just a search, this was a hunt deep inside the woods. They stopped for a moment to catch their breath, and Daniel pressed his hand against a tree, his chest burning as if fire filled his lungs, and Lyra leaned against him, whispering that she was sorry for dragging him into this. Daniel shook his head and told her it was too late to turn back, because he could not let them take her, and the moment he said those words he realized they were true, and it was not only because of the strange bond she claimed, but because he felt it himself in his heart. Lyra touched his forehead with her glowing hand, and suddenly images burst into his mind again, visions of her world torn apart by fire and war soldiers with armor of steel and machines that darkened the sky, and she told him with her weak, trembling voice that her people had been hunted almost to extinction, because they were different, because they had a gift that others feared and wanted to control, and she said that when her world fell, She followed the call of his soul because it was the only hope she had left, and Daniel felt tears sting his eyes because the weight of her words was too heavy and yet too real to deny. They moved again deeper into the woods, following narrow paths that twisted through the trees, and Daniel kept listening for the sound of pursuit, and it was never far because the soldiers spread out with bright lights and radios crackling orders, and sometimes Daniel could see the glow of their flashlights between the trees, and he knew they were getting closer, step by step. But he also noticed something strange. The soldiers moved carefully, as if they were afraid. And he wondered if it was Lyra they feared or something else that followed her here from the stars. Night grew colder and darker, and finally they found an abandoned shed deep in the woods, half broken and covered in vines, and Daniel led Lyra inside and helped her sit on the dusty floor, while he tried to catch his breath and figure out what to do next, because he knew they could not stay here for long, but at least it gave them a moment of safety and silence, and in that silence Lyra took the glowing crystal again and placed it in his hand and told him to look. Daniel held the crystal, and his vision blurred as new images filled his mind, but this time they were sharper and clearer, and he saw himself standing in that great hall again beside Lyra. But it was not only a vision of another world, it was like a memory, and he felt the weight of armor on his shoulders and the sound of voices calling his name, and Lyra looked at him in the vision with the same eyes she looked at him now, and she called him her husband, and Daniel staggered as the vision ended because it felt too real and too heavy to be only imagination. Wanted to deny it again, but the truth pressed harder on his chest, and he realized that maybe he was connected to her in ways he could not explain. Maybe he had always been more than what he believed. And as that thought filled his mind, the silence outside shattered with the sound of engines and lights flooding the woods, and the crackle of loudspeakers ordering him to surrender, and Daniel knew the soldiers had found their trail, and they were closing in fast. Lyra looked at him with desperation in her silver eyes, and whispered that he had to decide now whether to accept the bond and fight, or to let her be taken and live with regret forever. And Daniel felt the weight of the choice crushing down on him, because he was just one man and they were many. But when he looked at her fragile, trembling form and remembered the vision of him standing beside her in the hall, he felt something inside him shift, like a locked door opening at last, and he knew he could not abandon her. Daniel stood up, his fists clenched and his breath steady, and he whispered that if they wanted her, they would have to go through him first. And as the soldiers closed in on the shed, and the sound of boots and barking dogs grew louder, he felt the strange warmth of the bond surge through his body, stronger than ever before. And Lyra whispered that his time had come, and that his human spirit was more powerful than he could ever imagine. The shed walls shook with the sound of approaching soldiers, and Daniel held his breath, ready for whatever was coming next, knowing that the chase was not over, but only just beginning. The shed walls trembled as the sound of heavy boots and crackling radios grew closer, and Daniel felt his breath slow, as if his body was preparing for something that he did not yet understand. And Lyra clutched his arm with trembling fingers, her silver eyes glowing weakly in the darkness, and she whispered that if they caught her, it would mean the end, not only for her, but for him as well. And Daniel looked at her and saw the fear that she tried to hide, and for the first time in his life, he felt that his ordinary world had been left far behind, and that he stood at the edge of something too vast to imagine. Voices outside shouted commands, and Daniel could hear the dogs snarling as they pulled at their leashes, eager to tear apart whatever they were hunting, and he knew they had only seconds left before the soldiers forced their way inside. So he took Lyra by the hand and pulled her toward the back of the shed, where broken boards gave way to a narrow passage that led deeper into the woods, and together they crawled through the gap, their bodies scraping against the jagged wood, until they emerged into the cold night air once more. And Daniel pulled her to her feet, and they stumbled forward into the trees. The forest was alive with danger as bright beams of flashlights cut through the darkness, and radios crackled with orders, and Daniel could feel the soldiers tightening the net around them step by step, and though he carried Lyra's weight across the uneven ground, he felt stronger than he should have been, as if the warmth of her bond flowed into his muscles and kept him moving faster than fear would allow, and Lyra whispered between shallow breaths that this was the beginning. That his strength was not his alone but theirs together. They ran until the trees opened into an old abandoned factory at the edge of town, its broken windows staring like hollow eyes, and its rusted doors hanging loose on their hinges, and Daniel pulled her inside the vast dark space where shadows covered the floor and old machines stood like giants, long forgotten, and there at last they stopped, their breaths ragged and their hearts pounding with the knowledge that they could not run forever. Daniel turned to Lyra and demanded the truth because he could no longer live with only fragments and visions, and he needed to understand why she had come to him and why the soldiers were willing to tear the world apart to find her. And she looked at him with weary eyes, and for a moment she was silent, as if she was afraid of what the truth would do to him. But then she began to speak, her voice soft yet steady. She told him that her people had been dying long before the war had come, because their bodies were strong but their souls were fragile, and they had searched for a way to survive, and in their desperation, they had created a great experiment to link their souls with those of another species, one that was young and full of life, and in their search they had found Earth, and they had found humanity, and they had chosen Daniel. Long ago, though he had never known it, because the connection had been planted like a seed that would one day awaken. Lyra explained that the visions he had seen in the crystal were not lies and not illusions. They were echoes of what had been written long before he was born. And though he had lived as an ordinary man, his soul had carried the mark of their bond. And when her world fell and her people were scattered across the stars, she followed the call that only she could hear, and it led her to him, the one who could keep her alive in this hostile world. Daniel listened in silence as the weight of her words settled on him, and he felt as if the floor beneath him was no longer solid, because everything he thought he knew about himself was breaking apart, and he wanted to deny it, to tell her that she was wrong. But deep inside he knew the truth had already been stirring inside him, because no ordinary man could have survived what he had just faced. No ordinary man could have carried her through the woods with soldiers on his heels and still be standing now. And as he looked at her fragile form glowing faintly in the shadows, he realized that he was no longer ordinary at all. But before he could speak, the sound of shattering glass rang through the factory, and bright beams of light cut across the floor as soldiers stormed through the broken windows, their voices sharp and their weapons raised. And Daniel pulled Lyra behind one of the rusted machines, his heart pounding so loudly he thought they would hear it. And Lyra clutched his arm and whispered that there was one last secret she had kept, and she pressed something cold and metallic into his hand. Daniel looked down and saw an alien weapon, unlike anything he had ever seen. Its surface etched with glowing lines, and its weight heavy, as if it carried more than metal inside. And Lyra whispered that it was never meant for humans, that only her people could wield it, but she believed that the bond would allow him to use it, and that without it they would not survive the night. The soldiers moved closer, their boots echoing on the hollow floor, and Daniel tightened his grip on the weapon, his mind filled with doubt, because he had never even fired a rifle, let alone something from another world. And yet as his fingers wrapped around the alien handle, the weapon pulsed with light as if it recognized him, and power surged through his arm, so strong that he staggered backward and almost fell. But he did not let go. Lyra's eyes widened as she whispered that it had accepted him, and that this proved what she had said all along, that he was not just a man, he was her bond, her partner, her chosen one. And Daniel felt the truth strike him like a thunderclap, because the weapon was alive in his hands, and it was waiting for him to act. The soldiers shouted as they spotted movement, and their lights turned toward the machine where Daniel and Lyra crouched, and Daniel took a deep breath, his fear burning away into something sharper and stronger, and he whispered to himself that if they wanted her, they would have to go through him, and then he stepped out from the shadows with the weapon raised. A factory filled with chaos as the soldiers opened fire and Daniel squeezed the weapon with both hands, and a burst of light exploded from it, ripping through the air like thunder and striking the floor in a flash that sent the soldiers scattering. And Daniel stood in shock because he had not known what to expect. But the weapon responded to him as if it had been waiting for this moment. Lyra cried out for him to move, and he ducked behind another machine as bullets tore through the metal and sparks flew into the air. And he realized this was only the beginning, because more soldiers were pouring into the factory, and they would not stop until he and Lyra were either captured or destroyed. And in that moment, Daniel understood the weight of his choice and the path that lay before him. He was no longer the ordinary man who had lived quietly in a small town. He was something more, something dangerous and something powerful. And as the soldiers closed in on them, he knew the bond between him and Lyra would decide not only their fate, but perhaps the fate of much more than he could imagine. The factory shook with the sound of gunfire, and Daniel felt the ground tremble beneath his feet as soldiers poured through every broken window, their voices sharp with orders, and their flashlights cutting through the shadows like knives. And yet in his hands the alien weapon pulsed with power, alive and fierce, as if it had been waiting only for him. And though he had never held anything like it before, he felt its energy flow into his body, filling his arms and chest with strength. And for the first time since this nightmare began, he did not feel like prey running from hunters. He felt like something stronger, something that could stand and fight. Lyra crouched behind a broken machine, her silver eyes wide with fear, yet also filled with belief, as she watched him step into the open and raise the weapon. And Daniel felt that belief press into his heart, like fire, urging him to keep going and not give in, because if he fell now, then she would be lost, and everything she had fought for would end here in this ruined place. The soldiers fired, and Daniel moved without thinking, his body reacting faster than his mind, as bursts of light leapt from the weapon in his hand, striking the ground in front of them and sending shockwaves that knocked men off their feet and tore holes through the concrete floor. The sound was deafening, and sparks rained down like falling stars, and Daniel realized that the weapon was not only answering his commands, it was shaping itself to his will, as if it knew what he needed before he even did. The soldiers shouted in panic, some calling for retreat, others pressing forward, but Daniel did not stop. He kept moving across the factory floor, the heat of the weapon burning against his skin, and every time he fired, the air cracked like thunder, and the soldiers scattered, as if they were facing not a man but a storm that could not be controlled. And behind him, Lyra whispered his name, not in fear but in awe, as if she too was seeing what he was becoming. But more soldiers came, wave after wave, pouring into the factory, their armored figures dark against the flashes of light, and Daniel knew that no matter how strong the weapon was, he could not fight them all forever. And Lyra must have known it too, because she crawled to his side and whispered that they had to leave now, that he could not waste his strength here, because the bond was meant for more than survival, it was meant for destiny. And Daniel clenched his jaw, because though he did not fully understand, he knew she was right. He grabbed her hand, and together they ran through the maze of machines, the weapon flashing in his free hand as he blasted open a path through the soldiers who tried to block their way. And the sound of collapsing steel echoed through the factory as old beams fell and sparks lit the air like fireflies. And Daniel pushed forward, carrying Lyra, when she stumbled, until at last they burst through a side door into the night air. The forest stretched before them, dark and endless, but behind them the glow of headlights and the roar of engines told him the soldiers would not give up. And Daniel felt the weight of choice pressing down harder than ever, because they could run again and maybe hide for a while, but they would always be hunted, and sooner or later they would be caught unless he made a stand here and now and ended it. Stopped at the edge of the trees, his chest heaving, his eyes scanning the night, and he whispered to Lyra that he was done running, that if the soldiers wanted to take her, they would have to face him first. And Lyra looked at him with tears in her glowing eyes, and whispered that this was his decision, and his alone, and she would follow him wherever he chose, because the bond could not force love or duty, it could only reveal it. And in that moment, Daniel felt something inside him settle like stone. Because he knew his choice was clear, the soldiers came crashing through the undergrowth, their lights flashing between the trees, and Daniel stepped forward, raising the weapon with both hands, the bond surging like fire in his veins, and he shouted for them to stop, but they kept coming, and so he unleashed the full fury of the weapon, and the night exploded with light brighter than lightning and louder than thunder, as waves of energy tore through the forest floor, sending trees crashing and soldiers flying in. For a moment the whole world seemed to burn with his power. When the smoke cleared, Daniel stood trembling, his arms heavy, and the weapon glowing faintly as if it too was exhausted, and around him the forest lay broken, the soldiers scattered, groaning and retreating, and none dared to move closer, and Daniel realized with shock that he had done it. He had stopped them not with luck, but with something inside him that was stronger than he had ever believed. Lyra stepped to his side, her hand warm on his arm, and she whispered that he had proven the truth, that humans were more than ordinary, that in their hearts they carried a strength her people had never understood, and that was why the bond had chosen him and not another. And Daniel looked at her and saw not only an alien who had fallen into his life, but a partner who had trusted him, even when he did not trust himself. Together, they walked deeper into the forest, leaving the broken battlefield behind them, and Daniel felt no fear now, only resolve, because he knew more soldiers would come and more battles would follow, but he also knew that he was no longer just a man hiding in a small-town basement. He was something else now. He was a fighter, a protector, and perhaps even a leader. And as Lyra leaned against him, her strength slowly returning, he whispered that whatever waited for them in the wider galaxy, he would face it, not because of fate or destiny, but because he had chosen to. And in that moment, under the silent stars, Daniel no longer felt ordinary at all. He felt human, and in this vast universe filled with powers and empires and wars, that word meant something extraordinary, and it meant that the story of him and Lyra was only just beginning. The end.